Hey guys, hope you're having a good day today. So I was doing some research this morning, thinking about all my ideas, and it's way warmer today, so that's kind of nice because it's been like super cold the last couple of days, and so it's all like chappy when it's cold like that. But okay, so let's continue on just talking about the different ideas that are out there, and you know, uh, see where those take us, and try to develop further with it, and so on and so forth. Once again, so if you're new to my channel, my name's Jennifer, and I just cover whatever stuff I'm thinking about at the time. Typically, it's something to do with, history or mythologies or folklore or things of this nature. Um, this isn't. I don't really take time to edit or anything like that, so it's completely just off the cuff. So if you're in a hurry or something like that, this may not be, your forte. But I kind of too just try to piece together a great deal of information, usually from a wide span of research. I do organic researching basically, so like I'll start with one idea. From that idea, it leads to other ideas, and I kind of just free flowing follow that line of thought, and it yields quite a bit of really fascinating information. So I hope you subscribe to my channel if you enjoy this content. And if you have any thoughts or something to add, or something you'd like that you're thinking about or curious about, please put it down in the comments. And then you can support my channel through my PayPal down in the description, or just share the video. That'd be awesome if you think if you have any value out of it. So this morning when I woke up, I had wanted to continue on. I had talked to a friend of mine that I'm fairly close to, have known for years and years and years, and they recounted that they'd had a nightmare. And I was like, oh, this person never tells me like their dreams. Usually they don't have dreams. Like I've asked them about their dreams, but they usually don't have any. But this time actually, they told me that they'd had a nightmare, and I was like, oh no, like what was it? Because I'm really into nightmares and dreams, and because I used to have night terrors. Okay, so he tells me that what happened was, they were, like, in the dream, they were in this kind of near a house. There was like this really strange looking house, and then there was a hill kind of off in the distance, like a mound. On top of the mound was a merry-go-round, and they were there with like 2 or 3 other people, and then there was this girl there too. And what they claimed was that in the dream, they were talking about the house itself and who lived there, and there was some man that lived there. And then the girl says in the dream, oh, but he had a sister, and his sister lives over there under that hill. And she points over to the mound that has the merry-go-round on top of it. And they were like, whoa, that's really weird. She lives underground. That's strange. And she's like, yeah. And they get to talking. And they were going to go, supposedly, adventuring into that, the man's house. And I guess it was really eerie looking. So the whole vibe of the dream is that it's kind of eerie. Dark palettes of color when I asked about that. So they're in this very spooky sort of mindset in the dream. At this point, though, in the dream, the girl says, I'm going to go up to that merry-go-round on top of the hill. And they're like, okay, go ahead. So she does. And they just go back, the dreamer, he just goes back to talking with the other individuals. And they don't really pay her any attention. Then they can hear her up on the merry-go-round, and she's on the merry-go-round. And I guess it's like just kind of going around very slowly. The merry-go-round is moving, and she's standing on it, and she's got her hands up like this, and she's like, it wasn't singing per se. It was more like kind of praying. If you were his way, like, praying. So she's up there doing that, and saying stuff like, of some type of love, towards like to this on top of this mound, on top of this merry-go-round. And they're like, wow, it's really strange and creepy, and like that's what the dreamer relayed. Well, then though, they look back and they continue on with what they're doing, And then when they look back again, they see that she's no longer on the hill, and they can see through the mound into the hill, and inside of the hill, they can see that the girl that was up there doing this, she's now inside the hill, but he can see through the hill, and can see that she's now, no, the merry-go-round is still up above the hill, but somehow she's descended into it. There's no hole from the top, you can see from the side. And there's these fan blade, like, well, as described. If you think of the spoke in the center, and then the blades coming out from a fan, for example, and she's walking, and there's space in between. No, there's not a deadfall beneath. So that's not the case. It's not like a deadfall beneath, but it's above this, it's like a platform of sorts above the ground, inside the hill. They can see inside it like a room inside this hill, and there's a spoke pole down the middle, kind of from that merry-go-round, almost like a wheel chamber. And then there are fan blades coming out from the spokes, like you would see on a wheel or, say, a fan blade. And the lady she's walking like this, holding onto the pole, and kind of pacing around in a circle on those fan blades. And I guess that she's still, she's still kind of doing this praying thing as she's walking around this circle, like, kind of swinging around this thing. But those blades are not moving, the platform's not moving. At this point, they notice that around the circle of the fan blade, there's like 5 or 6 people who have just appeared out of nowhere. And they're skulking creepily about the fan blade. And, like, as described, sort of sneakily, walking around in a circle around her, and she's oblivious to it. She can't see them. She can't see these people who are, like, oblivious but are pacing around the circle. And I guess it was pretty creepy. So then he decides that they're going to run up to the hill and try to help her in some way. And so they do get up to the hill, and they can see inside, but now they can see through the hole, the sort of seems to be like a window into the hill itself. They can see that there's like what appears to be like almost like she's in a glass cage or a glass box. And that's why they were yelling and she could not hear, because they were inside this glass box. Then I guess all of the people have disappeared except for one. And there's just this one man kind of still skulking around, following her, and she's still oblivious to this man, and he's got a knife. And so he's skulking around, and, like, she doesn't see. And then, I guess, like, there's a wheel there, and so he goes to, like, spin the wheel, like a, kind of like a crank or something, to, like, and it's lifting the glass. Well, whenever they go to do this, to try to get in to help this lady, the guy with the knife stabs her, like, stabs the girl, this woman, with the knife. And she, like, she dies. And then, like, they're like, oh my God. And then he, like, cuts her throat, and then it was just, and then he said that he could not see anything then. They could not see anything, but they heard a voice, and the voice said, now she's a guide for the end. Like, this disembodied voice echoes this out. And that was the dream, and it was this horrible nightmare, and I was like, whoa, that's very bizarre. So then I started thinking about a guide for the end, and it got me to thinking about all this stuff right here. It made me think of, what would be like a guide for the end, and what it would be like perhaps a spirit guide of sorts. And then I was thinking about, okay, so I've thought about this several times before, about sacrifice itself, human sacrifice, and if there was something to it to do with, by sacrificing a person, the idea is that the spirit of that individual will now be in service to the spirit it was dedicated to in the afterworld, in the afterlife, where beyond the fire, And so that's what I want to talk about a little bit. That's kind of where I started. Okay, so I want to talk about human sacrifice, blood sacrifices, and what the deal is with that. And when I was doing research about this, human sacrifice goes back, I mean, forever. But the idea that, okay, so I was thinking, when people, I've heard of this in cases where people kill other people, that there was more of a mystical side to it. Even like in some cases of some of the most famous serial killings, there seems to be ritualistic atmosphere with it in a way. I think that there is some, and among the tailed headhunters of North Africa, a book written in 1912, the man went to visit with these tribes in northern Africa off the Gold Coast. And they have a lot of really interesting folklore about the idea of human sacrifice and how the sacrificed become a slave to these to either who they were dedicated to or to whoever they were sacrificed by. So a person, the idea being that when you take a person, and I think it matters too a great deal about perhaps the spirit, the nature of the person who was taken. If they were, for example, a virgin, or they were of a pure like mindset or an innocence, perhaps. I wondered if that has something to do with it. It seems to be the case. I think that the nature of how they are killed too is extremely important in this case. It seems like there's either a specific type of knife. In fact, it makes me think of, just now I was thinking of, if you've ever heard of Ted Gunderson, he talks a great deal about, look up Ted Gunderson, and he talks a great deal about sacrifice and secret cults, around the world that still practice some of these darker rituals that people aren't really privy to, but they are still operative and still active in America and around the world today. And they still practice some of these old rites of human sacrifice or animal sacrifice. And I was thinking too, it makes sense that, even in the instance of the sacrifice of animals or people, that these spirits become the servants of whoever they were dedicated to, and they, willing or unwilling. And I think of many times, in fact, and there was a story out of, it was Arkansas, actually, northern Arkansas, in a region I did much studying about in northern Arkansas in the Ozark Mountains, where the natives at the time who were living in that region, they still had an old practice of human sacrifice that they would do. And typically what it was the individual was either taken as a child from another village or abducted in a way and brought into the village, and then they were treated usually very well. And they were fed well, they were cared for, and then they would be later on strung up across, basically it's always the cross in almost every instance, but they'd be strung up on this, and then they'd be shot through with arrows, and there's a gathering of the blood, and it's called like the Flaming Heart ritual or something. It's pretty horrible. I thought that it had a lot to do with perhaps they were doing it in reverence of Sirius, which was a very important star to so many different groups at the time. But when they talked to an elder of the tribe and he was relaying the process of how they do these sacrifices, he did say that they approached it as almost like a sort of, not something they necessarily wanted to do, but something that they had always done, and so that they continued to do. And they referred to it as a way of feeding evil in a way, so that the evil will not have to be starved in a way and then come and do evil upon people unexpectedly. So their ideology behind this was, if we take a person and cause them, they die this way, probably terrified, probably horrified, and then it's a kind of a slow, torturous type of death in a way, and they're frightened. This essence is offered to this diabolical force of nature or the spirit realm that then is being satiated, doesn't act out randomly in the tribe, thereby causing accidents or unusual occurrences or illnesses that are, in fact, at that time, you would have many horrific illnesses. But perhaps this would stave their hunger, their bloodlust of sorts, if they just kind of did it their own way and offered it as a sacrifice to this entity. So the idea being that just thinking about that the pain and the suffering and the terror in a controlled manner, where they go and they, like I say, they take this victim, usually a girl of, virgin age, and they treat her very, very well, very delicately, they feed her and they keep her very comfortable, and she has the highest, never saw it coming type of thing. Is what I'm getting at, that they don't know that they're going to be sacrificed. And nobody tells them. And they're treated this way for quite a while. They're like kind of fat-catted up, happy and healthy, and then they're taken very religiously to this place, and then they are extinguished, snuffed out, in order to feed a malevolent spirit beyond the veil that will feed regardless, but might be satiated, and they feel like they're doing a good deed. Do you see how confusing this is? Anyway, so that's one thing I want to mention about the human sacrifice, and I was thinking about spirit guides. And I was thinking about, people talk about the spirit guides. It was actually very prevalent in the African tribes and cultures that they believed that the spirits of the dead, the living dead as they're referred to in this instance, the living dead, that they would be guides to the living and messengers between the living and God. And they did believe in God in the sense that everyone conceives of as a grand maker of all things. But that it's very similar to the idea of demons and angels and saints in a lot of other religious beliefs playing messenger between humanity and the gods, because they had that they cannot, that God is some distant thing that they can't be in touch with or in contact with, and so therefore they make pacts and they make offerings, and they, in the cases out of, for example, the I'm trying to think of the tribes' names of the Sumerians. But the Sumerians, I always get them. There's the Sumerians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Hittites. I mean, on and on and on. But in those groups, hold on. No. It was Hermes. Hermes talking about in Egypt how their fathers had known the art of creating gods. And what they did was they made these statues, and then they would, pardon me, well, I'm talking quite a bit. They would try to invoke the spirits of demons, or, in this case, by demons, I mean like these types of forces that are in between, that play an intermediary between man and God, but that they would be willing and happy to come down and stay within these statues and be reverenced and worshipped and made offerings to, and it's so much so that they would even speak, and that there were these speaking statues in Egypt, and they were able to communicate with them and have favors bid upon them or illnesses taken away via these statues. This reminded me very much, though, of sort of the same idea of the spirit guides out of North Africa, when they talk about having the dead, the deceased, their ancestors, that would work on the other side in the other realm, but also could work in this realm, and that they were the middle ground between mankind and God. And I just thought that was really interesting, the parallel that instead of it being demons or angels, it's our deceased ancestors that they're talking about. So I thought that was fascinating, and it makes me think about with the spirit guide that I do many times wonder, about the familiars. So in the case of familiar, like in the story of the witch of Endor in the Bible, where Saul goes to get the spirit of Samuel, I think, conjured up by the witch of Endor. And what he says was, find me a woman who has a ghost or an odd. This is not the exact quote, and it doesn't have to be. But bring me the witch or the odd, O-D, or Ode. I'm not sure how you would pronounce that necessarily, Ode or odd. but that possesses such a thing, you know, and bring her to me, and I want to conjure this ghost. So she's a necromancer, a soothsayer, and a ventriloquist. Because I did a lot of research. Look into it when you have time. But she was, so ventriloquism. I'm kind of skipping some things, am I? One thing I did want to mention about the slaves in the afterlife, you know, that's really creepy. I've heard about that in many different cases of paranormal experiences too, where the psychics are talking with the people who are haunting a location, and they are being held there by some force, and they are being made to perhaps do things they wouldn't normally want to do, and I think that that's very interesting. Anyway, so then, and the African beliefs too, I don't mean to say African beliefs, but on the Gold Coast of Nigerian, the northern Nigerian tribes, because Africa is so huge. Anyway, there's a lot of reference to the spiders. And, you know, Michael Strange on Troubled Minds, he's done several, he's fascinated by spiders as well, because I noticed he does a lot of shows about spiders, and I always find them extremely fascinating. You should check those out. But they have a great deal to say about the spiders. I'm not going to go into it in this one because it's not really it doesn't really necessarily flow into what I'm talking about. But while I was doing research about the tailed headhunters Africa, I found that they were talking about, well, that right there stood out to me. Tailed headhunters. And I was like, tailed? Did they have tails? Because I've heard a lot about people having tails, and I think it's fascinating. And there are people who have tails. So I was doing research about that, about people who have tails, and of course they do. And this is very interesting because I had a dream one time about wisdom teeth, and the dream was very fixated about that I saw this individual, and they were showing me their teeth, and they had like their mouth went way back, and they had extra wide mouths. I don't know how to explain it. Almost like not like a canine, but that their faces came out, and when they opened their mouth, I could see all the way back to their mouth was, and she was pointing back at her wisdom teeth. She was showing me her teeth. It's a weirdest dream. And it got me to thinking all about that. And it's really interesting too. I'll do a show, I guess, eventually about wisdom teeth and people with tails, because I think it's fascinating. And the Eskimo believe that they are descended from the wolves, and the Romans believed they were descended from the wolves, and there are other tribes who believe they were descended from dogs. And I don't want to, the reason that that's important in talking about this is that all people may not have, though we think of ourselves as being very civilized, very ordered, in fact, we come from a very curious and bizarre human field of history. And the tales of the folklore of our forefathers and of our ancestors do have a very mixed and mingled thing about us being members and participators in the folklore itself, as being beings who were not what we would call today natural. And so even to the point of people who live in the wood and the moss, out of the German and Slavic beliefs, and that the Fey folk in some instances aren't supernatural in the slightest, but they were people who had retained some type of incredible abilities. This ties back into the power of the brain that I've talked about, that I think that the brain, not for telepathic powers, that's not what I'm really trying to say, but yet that if the mind could contain so much information, we are amazed by the computer on a continual basis. When you think about it, we are so impressed with AI and computers and the internet and all the information it holds. And yet none of these computers can hold the information that one brain of a human being can. None of them. And so I think it's incredible to think that if somehow, and we are a much better database for receiving and retrieving this information, because for us it's instantaneous, there's no dial-up, there's no nothing, it's wireless, the original wireless, the human brain. This is fascinating because if people in the ancient world didn't have to have giant brains, even just a little brain, but have access to all of the forces and power of the intellect, and could contain so much incredible information, and then be able to access it at will, of all the seasons and the star mapping and everything, and all the use of plants and the weather and the communication with animals and all of the languages. Not mistaking that they may have all shared the same language. However, just that they would have access to all this information and much, much more. Endless ability to retrieve, just photographic memory, basically. Anything like this would have made people later on think of them as being magical, supernatural, gods, incredible. It's just one facet, because I still enjoy thinking of, because I'm not committed to any of this, but I mean, just that I like to think of all of it as much as the next person. Now, okay, so familiars, the ventriloquist thing. This is about, I'm almost done. Hell, 25 minutes, I'm so sorry. Anyway, telepathy, ventriloquism, I want to talk about that. And then the last thing I'm going to talk about is shadows, shadow casting. So the ventriloquism thing and telepathy, I think this is telepathy itself. What if there is a race of beings or people that are purely telepathic, and I have briefly brushed up against this several times. Anyway, the idea that there are forces, like, say even just people, that they are secreted away somewhere, and that they have very powerful telepathy, and then they can get into the minds of individuals and see inside of their mind and project ideas into their mind. And then you have the instance of ventriloquism, where they are, because, okay, the Witch of Endor, sorry I skipped over that. If she was a ventriloquist, basically think of channeling. Or, Python, the Delphi Oracle, that they were the soothsayers, the snake, the idea of the Essenes, and the Nasa, and the soothsayers. The idea behind that is that, in Python, is that this oracle of sorts, and who's it coming from? And you think of the stars, and anyway, the dragon, and Thuban, on and on and on, in the order of the dragon. I don't want to go into that per se, but just about the reason it had this, it's interesting, the connection of all of those different sounds, and then the whispering, and the soothsayer, and then that they would be they'd be, because there's a mythos too, that in the punishment of the snake, in the case of Adam and Eve, that later on, even in another instance, that he was still harassing Adam and Eve, that he was made mute. The snake in the garden was made mute, because it could speak before that. As we know, it spoke to Eve. So, if the snake was made mute in one mythology, but yet the snake can ventriloquism, like through ventriloquism, can speak through a host of sorts, and then soothsay, whisper, oracles, and wisdom, and knowledge, and so on and so forth, or whatever, or deceive, or be tricky. Maybe not as tricky as a spider, but anyway. So I thought that was interesting, and I was wondering if there was a class of people, or a group somewhere, that does use their powers of telepathy, and if they could puppet people, or ventriloquism, speak through them in some way, not necessarily the Python itself, but literally some individuals somewhere who have this ability, what would they use that for? And is there anything to it? And I will be looking so much, I'm going to have to look into that much more, but I was thinking about that weeks and weeks ago, and I've heard people talk about it and stuff like that, and I think it's fascinating, and we're going to talk about it too. But then the other thing I was thinking about, so I barely touched on the ventriloquism thing, but now it's carrying on to almost 30 minutes, and that's a little too long. But the other thing I want to talk about is shadow casting, and how demons in a lot of cases can't cast a shadow. And I wanted to think about that today, and shadow being the way that shadows are cast, and the weight of, I don't know, I just think there's something important about that. There's something important about shadow casting, and there's something important about not casting a shadow, and I just wanted to bring that up as well. So you guys have a great day, and thanks for hanging in there with me for a long time. Once again, I'm sorry. This carried on a bit, but please donate to my channel if you like this content. Share it, and please subscribe if you enjoy and want to see more. Have a good day.